Welcome back to our podcast. Today, our guest is Terrence Houlihan, who is with the City University of New York Lehman College. And Terry, you have a real interesting background on learning, adult learning, adolescent learning. You've interacted with adult learners in the MBA program, and your expertise is in the brain and how that works. And there's a couple of concepts that we're seeing out there in the workplace and the educational institutions. One is the notion that the way people, the perspective that individuals have in terms of decision making, in terms of their ability to interact with streaming real-time information differs across generations. As well, on the academic side, there's real changes in the way universities and colleges are working in terms of how do we structure learning environments. For example, there's been some move away from the use of books more towards videos, simulations, for example. So we're seeing in the academic side a shift in terms of the way learning is being done, and as well in the organizational setting in terms of personal development and trying to figure out how we can make the best of our individuals by understanding them, what not only motivates them, but their brain structure as well. And I was wondering if you could start us off with a sense for how the differences in learning between various generations, between individuals, and that brain structure.
Certainly. First, thanks for having me. I appreciate it. And to address that, I think we have to look at the advent of the smartphone and how that changed the way in which we communicate. And when I say we, James, I'm including older adults, middle-aged adults, the young adults, and teenagers, all the way down to pre-adolescence. It's definitely impacted our communication styles, and it's probably also impacted, the way in which our brains respond to situations. For example, there is I don't want to call it a syndrome, but there is a phenomenon known as the phantom smartphone, where people will, in their a shirt pocket in their pant pocket, will feel their phone vibrate even when it really isn't. And this, goes to show how much we've become, enmeshed with our phones. The reality is, according to a lot of research, the average teenager will send approximately 200 texts per day. Their predominant form of communication is via text. And when I say teenagers, I don't think it's really the traditional 12 to 18 to a large degree. I think it also expands a lot and grows into that young adult piece. So the college students, young professionals in the workforce, I have a 25-year-old son. And for myself, being middle-aged, it can be a little frustrating because many of us are used to communication via telephone, via in-person, video conference, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't want to necessarily come across as somebody who, laments the new developments, but there is a piece lost in the communication of texting and email, so on and so forth, with tone and body language. There are numerous examples of where I've misread a text, I've misread an email because I can't necessarily pick up the inflection of what somebody is saying. So to some degree, there's definitely an area which the older generation needs to learn a little bit of the nuances associated with social media, texting, and there's a certain amount that the younger generation, to a degree, they need to unplug and reconnect with that face-to-face communication. In my work with families, one of the things that I often suggest, especially those with young adolescents, is that they put their phones down and they dedicate at least 4 out of 7 nights to dinner time and discussion. In the classes that I teach, both adults and with teenagers, there's no phone use for a certain period of time. But then, kind of like you said, we're moving away from the textbooks. There's a component where they have to log in to the publisher's website to access a PowerPoint, to access a couple of pages from the text. I guess what I'm trying to say, James, is that there are advantages and there are disadvantages, and we can actually begin to see them in brain scans and how brains are different today than they were in the past.
Well, let me pick up on that idea, Terrence, in that my understanding is that the wiring of the brain of an individual who's used to high interactive video games is very different than those that aren't. In other words, that those that interact with high interactive video games tend to achieve a sense of flow, in that mind and body meld together and fuse in with the stimuli that they're receiving from the video game. And my understanding is that this restructures their brain in some way that they are more attuned to intense real-time interaction and data. And this must have profound implications in both an organizational setting as well as the educational setting, when these individuals are used to achieving this sense of flow and they want information to be real-time. They want feedback to be spontaneous, well, not spontaneous, but instantaneous. And this view of how they're interacting must have profound implications in the way organizations and learning are going to be shaped over the next few decades.
100%. I mean, you go back, I think about 5 or 6 years ago to the Bloomberg Business Conference, and the feedback that came from middle management across, I forget the number of exact companies, but over 50% of middle management were saying that the millennial generation was demanding specific instantaneous feedback for menial, mundane tasks that they were doing. So these are people in entry-level positions. And as much as, human relationships oftentimes call for, positive feedback, etc., the report coming from middle management, a large number, was that they were demanding constant feedback about how they were doing, so on and so forth. And a lot of that could be connected to video games. There's a wonderful book called Nurture Shock. And, part of the premise of the authors is how the concept of everybody deserves a trophy, everybody gets a trophy, is really had some profound impact on the younger generation, particularly the millennials, because of that need for constant feedback, that need for, hey, how am I doing? What do I do next? From my perspective, in the work that I do in counseling, I oftentimes see it with teenagers and college applications. Even though this is based on the internet and the smartphone, many of them need to or require us, and when I say us, I'm talking about adults, to tell them what. It can be a little frightening at times, because these are, individuals who are going to be spending the next 4 to 5 years away from their parents, and if they don't know what button to click, that can be a little overwhelming for the parent that's saying goodbye. In the same context, it can be overwhelming for supervisors in the workforce. So, and it does impact brain development. It does impact the endocrinology of the brain. It impacts dopamine levels. So there are numerous studies that have been done that show that teenagers, particularly boys who spend over, I believe it's about 2.5 hours of video games, will release a lot of dopamine, similar to that we see in somebody who's using heroin or cocaine. It's, when talking about addiction in that context, there are 2 types of addictions. There's substance addiction, and then there's process addiction. And you speak to a parent of a teenager, or you speak to a supervisor of young adults, and they'll tell you video game addiction can be very, very real. So it can be a little frightening and intimidating, especially if you're not used to the way in which the younger generations interact with one another, ways in which they spend their leisure time.
Terrence, this idea that they'll have a different perspective, and I'm wondering how that's going to play out. If we think of video games, they can be very focused. For example, a fast-paced action game. And I'm wondering whether in the learning environment or the organizational environment, how does this change their ability to do multitasking or to operate in, or as you said, there may not be feedback, or there may be an environment in which decision making is slow. It's not as quick paced as what they're familiar with as real time. Or it may be that decision making is more focused on data analytics and making decisions on what data is saying as opposed to their intuition and their quick reaction that they may have or they may have come about from video games. Because if you think of video games, it's really kind of an intuitive feel to it. It's a hand-eye coordination. But if we're making decisions that are derived based on models and analytics, that moves away from this gut feel of quick response. And so I'm wondering how all of this is going to play out. Are we going to have to restructure organizations so that they're more gamified, that they're more faster oriented? We're going to see more empowerment. And in the learning environment, are we going to see a greater need for experiential and high intensity classrooms?
I think it's a mixture of both, James. There is value in like what you were saying about the video games, the speed at which someone can work can be tremendously advantageous within an organization. However, many decisions oftentimes need to be processed, and that presents a challenge for learning environments, especially the younger learning environments when you're talking about middle schools and high schools. I think to a large degree because of the developmental process, adults, particularly college students, graduate students, their learning environments, can be a little bit slower paced, but they do oftentimes need, like you were saying, more experiential learning. Aside from the classrooms that are over 50 students, more and more higher education institutions are moving away from lectures. They are doing videos. They're doing some experiential learning. You even have some institutions, highly respected institutions, that are doing away with final exams in certain classes. And that can create, a very, guttural response in people like, how could you change that? Because that runs very, very deep with people, the idea of a final exam. So there are some advantages to, the video game model. But at the same time, if you think about it, James, kids and teenagers and young adults are playing video games, and there's no extrinsic reward for it. They're just doing it for the sake of the experience with it. And, my premise is that one of the reasons why they do it is because it feels so good. It's releasing that dopamine. And one of the things that we can tap into is ways in which in the organization and in the classroom, we can release that dopamine, not from an addictive standpoint, but from the standpoint of those healthy activities. There are things like listening to music, processing information with friends, dancing, exercise, reading poetry, listening to others, laughter, humor. And if you yourself or really anyone listening, thinks about their most profound experiences with teachers or their most powerful learning experiences, most of those have happened in connection with another person. And one of the reasons why that is because, being around people, being in an environment where we feel supported, where we feel like we're having fun, from a biochemical perspective, what's happening is the brain is releasing dopamine, it's releasing oxytocin, and it's also releasing serotonin. And these are all, important hormones and neurotransmitters that are associated with positive feelings, happiness, and, believe it or not, learning as well. Video game addict is sort of reinforcing the activity, being in a supportive environment that encourages people to bounce things off of one another, process information, maybe, listening to music. And I'm not talking about, some elevator music, but music that really gets you going. You have a lot of open office spaces that may have game rooms nearby. There's some really interesting research that supports the efficacy of something like that. So it's very fascinating.
Well, Terrence, I'd like to see if we can get some takeaways for our audience, our listeners now. And I'm thinking in terms of the organizational environment, there's really two aspects that might be of immediate interest or things that they could implement right away. One is when they're evaluating candidates that are fresh out of a college or university environment, and let's say they're purposefully looking for people that have this highly interactive brain capability. How would they assess that? How would an HR individual assess a candidate? Would they put them in a highly stimulating environment to see how they react? And also for the organizational side, if individuals that coming out of university and college environment are very intrinsically motivated and they want this highly interactive environment with real-time feedback, this suggests that the whole leadership and corporate culture of that organization has to change to be much more follower-centric. Do you have any advice for the organizational environment?
Certainly. There's a great TED Talk by Mark Bowden, and his perspective is from an evolutionary psychological perspective. This idea that oftentimes our first interaction with someone, will sort of put them into certain categories. I'm not going to quote Bowden verbatim, but just for the sake of our discussion, Bowden says that most of us, when we first meet someone, we put them into the categories of friend, potential partners, enemies, or completely indifferent. And, Bowden's hypothesis is this idea that, our subconscious brain acts so fast in this because it's learned to survive in environments. And Bowden says most of us can sort of identify the friend by their level of openness, and openness in terms of their facial expressions, their bodily expressions, and these are people that we sort of gravitate to. So in terms of evaluating candidates, from an organizational perspective, people say it, they oftentimes don't like to put it in writing, but many interviews are oftentimes decided within the first, couple of minutes. So on the flip side of things, what I would suggest to people who are, going into an interview or people who are in academia is to encourage, students to develop more interpersonal skills, to learn to be more open, that yes, we are communicating via text. Yes, we do require a certain amount of feedback, but we do need to work with people as well. And the more open that we are with people, the more productive we can be. At the same token, you were asking about, how do leaders sort of adjust themselves? I wouldn't say that leaders need to go out and play video games themselves, but there's a servant leader sort of model out there in leadership. If anyone's looking for a quick read on it, Peter Norhaus has a fairly large textbook, but it's really, really simple. and it's just it's on leadership. And his description of the servant leader model is pretty powerful in that context. Learning what it is that your followers want, and sort of providing them with that sort of feedback can be useful.
Great, thank you, Terrence. And today we were talking with Terrence Houlihan of the City University of New York. Thank you very much, Terrence, for joining us.
Thank you, James. Appreciate it.
All right. Bye for now.